Our reading today is John chapter 2, verses 13 to 22. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. So he made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the moneychangers and overturned their tables. To those who sold doves, he said, "Get these out of here. Stop turning our Creator's house into a market." His disciples remembered that it is written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." The Jews then responded to him, "What sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all this?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." They replied, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you're going to raise it in 3 days?" But the temple he had spoken of was his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said. Then they believed the scripture and the words that Jesus had spoken. Thanks be to God.
We're being joined by our friend Trish Cook.
When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound, in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go down, lie down, where the wood drake rests his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of the wild things, who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still waters, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light, waiting with their light, waiting with their light. And for a time I rest in the grace of the world, and I am free. I am free. When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound, in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go down, lie down, where the wood drake rests his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of the wild things, who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still waters, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light, waiting with their light, waiting with their light. And for a time I
Beloved one, help liberate us from what we think we know, that we might discover more of reality, more of you, more of each other. Help us, please. Amen. This is one of the most famous gospel texts, Jesus entering the temple court at Passover, throwing over the money changers' tables. And as I've wrestled with this text this week, this is one of those texts, we've heard so often and so frequently that the power of it has somewhat been drained. We've been inoculated to the full dose of what is going on in this text. So let me try and make it really painful for us this morning, and so that we wouldn't just be unmoved by what had transpired, whatever it was, during this Passover week where Jesus entered Jerusalem and was at the temple. So John, the gospel that Kay read to us this morning, puts this story in the second chapter of his gospel at the very beginning, where the other three synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, place it at the very end, right before the crucifixion, this story. And so what's going on with that? Why does John throw it at the beginning? And I would suggest John puts this story near the beginning of his gospel to use it as an interpretive lens to understand so much of what Jesus said and did and was about. So it's like bringing the end of the story to the beginning so that as we hear the story, we know where it's going, and it unfolds or illuminates things that we might miss if we didn't know this. And so movies do this sometimes, where they'll put the very end of the movie in the first few frames so that as the story's going, you understand where it's going, and it helps you see things in a whole different context. And I would suggest that's possibly what the author of this gospel called John is doing here by putting this text or this story at the beginning. And for a lot of contemporary theologians, particularly N.T. Wright, this event was climactic in the ministry of Jesus and is what particularly led to his crucifixion. Because what he is doing, Jesus, in the temple, by overturning the money tables, the changers and all of this, and driving them out, is a total insurrection of the day. There could be nothing he could do, almost, that would be more of blowing up the current religious political system of the day, and to do it at Passover when there's this massive throng in Jerusalem where it's volatile and shaky to begin with. I mean, it is, if you think January 6th was insurrection, that was kindergarten compared to what Jesus is doing at the temple. Because what he is doing is basically saying everything you've put your trust in about how to connect with God is wrong. Everything you have relied on is mistaken. It's wrong. And it's going to be, it's doomed, and in several years it will all be abolished and destroyed. And so don't put your hope in this. I mean, Jesus could not have performed a more rebellious or sadistic, seditionist, not sadistic, but sedition, an act of sedition, if he wanted to. He's basically saying everything you've come to believe about Judaism, about how to connect with God, is what we've all been taught is wrong. And the crux of it is, there's the parallel text to what's going on in John here is in Mark chapter 11, Matthew chapter 21, and Luke chapter 19 are all these accounts. And in Mark's account, it becomes really clear. Jesus says, "You've turned my beloved's house, which was meant to be a house for all nations, you've put up all these barriers to get to God. And these barriers are heinous, they're wrong, and they're obscene. They will be destroyed, and they have got to go." To have some idea of the power of what Jesus is doing at this. The temple in Jesus' day, which was called the Second Temple or the Temple of Herod, the first temple was built by Solomon, and it was much smaller. And it was destroyed when the Babylonians came through and was razed to the ground. So after the people have come back from captivity, they've worked to rebuild this temple. Herod has become the king. He bribed, I believe it was Caesar in Rome, to become the king of Palestine, the king of the Jews. Herod himself was not fully Jewish. He was a descendant of Esau. He was an Edomite, a cousin of the Jews, but had paid off the Romans to become king. And the people didn't particularly like him. He was not well thought of. So to appease the people, he started a massive rebuilding of the temple, which he knew the people would really, really like. And so for 46 years, they've reconstructed this new massive temple. And often it was referred to as the Second Temple because nobody wanted to say it was Herod's temple because they hated Herod. But Herod made it all happen, raised money for it, built this massive temple. For 46 years, they've been constructing this beautiful masterpiece. And the belief of the day was that God would return to the promised land, to be with the promised people, and throw the stinking Romans out. And the Jews, the Jewish nation, the Hebrews, would be that light set on a hill that all nations would stream to and come to worship the one God. And they would have their independence and freedom, and all would be in harmony, again, as it is intended to be. That was the belief of the day. And Jesus has come along and said, that's absurd. Because what they had done in the temple, they had put up all kinds of barriers for people to connect with God. There was, to enter the temple courts, there was, first of all, the court of the Gentiles, where everybody could sort of come in. And this is where the Moneychangers were. And so anybody could come into the court of the Gentiles. But then it was like a filtering system. You had to go through a gate to leave the court of the Gentiles and go into the court of the women. And there was a sign over the court of the Gentiles that said, if you go beyond this point, you're taking your life into your own hands. We can kill you because you're not kosher to go past this point. You're not right. You're not good enough. You are other. You are not welcome beyond this point. So then the Jewish men and women could go into the court of the women. And then there was a further filtering system beyond the court of the women. Further in was the court of the men. And only men, women couldn't go in. Only men, Jewish men, could go in there. And then beyond the court of the men, there was the court of the priests. And even Jewish men couldn't go in. Only priests and Levites could go into that. And then beyond of that, there was the Holy of Holies that only the high priest could enter. It was a filtering system to get to God, because the word temple means a place where you can connect with the divine. A temple was a house of God. And so the powers that be of the day, the religious and the political leaders, had put up this filtering system to get to God. And this makes Jesus irate. You've put up these barriers to get to the beloved of who you think is kosher and who you think isn't. In fact, the Moneychangers were there because to make proper offerings to the God of the temple, Yahweh, you had to have unblemished animals, and they were only raised by the priests and the Levites. There was a lot of ritual that had to go through for a proper animal to be sacrificed. And so because of all the preparation and work into raising the proper animals, there was a handling fee because it always costs money. And you couldn't just use your Roman coins to buy the appropriate sacrifices. You had to convert your Roman coins to temple shekels because only temple shekels were appropriate. And of course, there was a slight handling fee for that conversion of Roman coins to shekels. And so they were making money off of people trying to connect with God. And in fact, in Mark's gospel, Jesus says, "You've turned the beloved's house into a den of robbers and thieves." And the Greek word used there is lestes, which means robbers by violence. It means muggers. It means people that not only take from you, but they beat you up while they're taking it from you. And they have taken what was meant for God for themselves. They're robbing what was intended for God for themselves and for their own profit. And this whole system, in Jesus' mind, is obscene and throws it all over and creates this huge... Not only is he creating a huge scene, he's doing it at the most volatile time possible. Because Passover, all the 6 times as many people would show up in Jerusalem as actually live there. So it's believed if Jerusalem had 100,000 folks, there's 600,000 people in town from all over. And the Romans were always scared of what would happen during these big festivals because that's when an insurrection or riots could take place. And their rule would be jeopardized. So the Romans are on high alert during all the festivals, particularly Passover. And so Jesus is fomenting a riot at politically the most sensitive time and is overturning everything and said, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. To put these barriers up between yourselves and getting close to the one we call the beloved, the God. And Jesus is irate. And this so infuriates the chief priests and the rulers, the political leaders, because they realize he has threatened their whole livelihood. What do you mean? You don't have to have a degree to preach. Then why did I waste all that money going to seminary? What do you mean? Anybody can do this. You're taking away our life. It's undermining everything by what Jesus was doing. All the power structures of the day were being assaulted by this act of Jesus in the temple courts. It was incredibly revolutionary and problematic. And it was from this event that it was decided Jesus must die. And in the Synoptic Gospels, that happens later in the week. And John wants you to see this from the very beginning. This is what Jesus is about, ripping down all the barriers between God and us. And Jesus then, the rulers and the chief priests come and say, by what authority, how dare you do this? Who do you think you are? By what authority are you doing this? And Jesus answers, tear this temple down, and in 3 days it will be raised up. And because they were a little thick and they hadn't had the right seminary courses, they thought he was talking about the temple that had taken 46 years to build by Herod. And Jesus was talking about his body. Jesus was saying, my body is the temple of God. What if Jesus is suggesting that you don't have to go to a temple to connect with God? What if God is accessible within you? Within your body, where we don't have to have this big building that we have to pay for and all these people to support it, and we don't need all the... What if the one we call God is accessible in the deepest places of who we are? Now, some believe that was particular to the body of Jesus, and what Jesus did at Calvary made it possible for all of us to access God on our interiority. Those are matters of faith. But certainly what Jesus is suggesting, we don't need all these trappings. We don't need all of this to connect with God. We can all connect with God. Jesus was taking a very particular religion that you have to believe this way. You have to listen to these creeds, these doctrines. You have to believe correctly in order to connect with God. And he shatters that and makes it universal. All peoples can connect with God. In Mark's version of this story, in Mark 11, Jesus is quoting Isaiah 56:7, where he says, "And my beloved's house will be a house of prayer for all nations, all ethnicities, all sexualities, all races, all peoples, all human beings, all ethnos." Everyone can have access to the beloved. And he ripped down every barrier possible. And that is one of the main reasons, according to N.T. Wright, the brilliant theologian, that Jesus was murdered on the Friday we call good. He shattered the system. And so as I've wrestled with all of this week, I've asked myself, what barriers have we put up? We don't have a court of the Gentiles and a court of the women and a court of the men and a court of the priests. But what barriers have we erected to keep people from connecting to the beloved creator of the universe, who loves every one of us, regardless of our religion, our race, our sexual identity, our age, our politics? What barriers have we erected? And during this Lenten season, it might be wonderful to reflect on how can we dismantle those barriers of our own choice so that Jesus might not have to come through and turn over our tables and drive us crazy. So, some thoughts for the third Sunday of Lent 2024.